What was the scariest experience of your life? Chances are you remember it as if it happened yesterday. In this story, an older man recalls an event that happened to him and his friends when they were teenagers. This occurrence happened to my friend Frank and myself in 1959. At the time, we were both about 13 years old and still attending junior high school. The time was about 8 o'clock p.m., but the month I no longer remember. I believe it was in autumn or winter. I lived in the county of Worcestershire, located roughly in the middle of England. The area was a housing estate owned by the local council. It was then a respectable area as I was only 8 or so years old. I believe the area is now more of a slum, but I haven't been there in over 33 years as we moved in the middle of the 1960s. I later relocated to Australia in 1967. On the street where we lived, the rear of our houses backed onto undeveloped bushland, which went out into some pretty unspoiled countryside in most directions. However, the area just to the rear and to the south was called the Burlish Camp. This camp was built during World War II as a repatriation, pardon my pronunciation, repatriation hospital for the U.S. servicemen. After World War II, it was used to house the Polish War refugees. As children, we played, mixed, and were schooled with their children. In the mid-1950s, the people were relocated and the whole area was knocked flat, except for one lonely structure called the Water Tower. As the name suggests, it was exactly that, a very large brick tower from childhood memory, about 50 feet by 50 feet by at least 80 feet high, with a giant water tank on the top. It was used to supply the camp with water. There were 8 windows, including 4 in the rear and 4 in the front. The first pair of windows were about 30 feet from the ground. The next pair were another 30 feet up. There was a steel door on the southern side, but it was bricked up in the mid-1950s. There was never any electricity to it, and it was inaccessible. Frank and I were just hanging out at the end of our street under a streetlight. This streetlight was at the junction of our tarred street and the wide dirt track which led over to camp, straight past the water tower and onto another small town about 4 miles farther on. During our conversation, Frank said, "Hey, look at those lights in the water tower." The tower was probably a quarter mile away, but could be made out in the moonlight. I was quite surprised because we could see some form of moving or blinking light in the window area of the tower. The light color did not appear as normal. This light was very shallow white, almost opaque. A short time later, about 20 yards from us on the dirt track, at an angle of about 45 degrees, we could see a light, the same color light that was in the tower. I remember we thought it was someone on a bicycle because the light seemed to fall to the ground. We started giggling, saying it must be someone drunk who fell off their bike. In the next instance, I remember myself drawn and staring wide-eyed at the figure of a man. I remember looking at his face. It had very distinguishable features, including a vertical flat forehead, long pointed nose, and sunken, very staring eyes. Because my concentration was so intense, I did not seem to observe any body detail, except the lack of normal motion movements. He appeared to float along. He was also transparent. We could see right through him. Then I picked up a stone and threw it in his direction. Frank was pulling at my left arm, screaming at me not to throw it. The stone, I estimate, fell short, but it was in line as it hit the soft grass with a thud. The man brought up his arm as if to protect his face, and my own legs went to jelly. I fell to the ground and the vision disappeared. Frank stumbled off, running, holding his ears and screaming. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the ground. A lady was standing over me asking if I was okay. I ran home very scared. Frank lost his hearing for 2 days. We made a pact not to tell anyone what happened to us for fear of ridicule. As time went by, we told, and we did get laughed at. This occurrence left a very bad mark on me. Many years later, my dad and I were passing the time talking about our family, being kids, where we lived, neighbors, and the like. My father told me how in the post-war years times were hard. Back then, 5 or 6 of the local ladies would work continuous night shifts in an electrical insulator manufacturing plant in the next town over from ours. He said that they would bicycle 8 to 10 miles to work each day instead of using the 4-mile-long shortcut through Burlish Camp. When I asked why, my father told me none of the women felt good about going that way. It always seemed very still and eerie, especially when they went past the tower. When they'd come home in the morning, the birds were singing, but up there by the tower, it was always still and quiet. Well, in the mid-1960s, the tower was removed to make way for a communications repeater station. The local news was there to cover the event. Apparently, it took 3 days of drilling and massive explosives to finally collapse the tower. The experts were scratching their heads because they couldn't understand how it had stayed up through so many explosive attempts.